Welcome back to Almost Nowhere, the podcast where we explore what's next for insurance and how to get there from here. I'm Alicia Burke, Director of Portfolio and Product Development at iCAS.
And I'm Max Martinelli, Lead Actuarial Data Scientist at Actuarial. Today, we're diving deep into the evolving intersection of technical product management, actuarial science, and data science, a convergence that's redefining how we build, price, and scale insurance products.
According to a recent Deloitte survey, over 40% of insurers are rethinking their actuarial teams as embedded strategy partners, not just modelers, but co-pilots in product design and decision-making. And that stat could just as easily apply to technical product managers.
Which brings us to today's guest, Drew Hill, a friend of mine and a product manager at Mutual Capital Analytics. Drew's career lives at the intersection of product, pricing, and performance, and he's someone who's actively blurring the old boundaries between the disciplines. Since joining Mutual Capital Analytics in 2021, Drew's worked with both personal and commercial lines clients on everything from new product development to pricing strategy and performance analytics.
And before that, Drew spent 6 years at Travelers, where he held roles spanning product management and business model effectiveness. He's also an alum of Cohort 2 of the AI Fast Track Bootcamp, giving him a front row seat to how insurers are upskilling for the AI era. Drew, we're thrilled to have you on the show. Welcome to Almost Nowhere.
Great. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate you having me on here.
Yeah, and Drew, so the reason that we invited you, I'll tell the story maybe in the outro, but when I first met you, I was kind of intrigued, but I've had both good experiences and bad experiences with product managers, but I had never really seen anyone kind of as technical as what you do at MCA. And so, when I'd been to the office and I'd kind of seen it, it really kind of captivated me. It kind of challenged some of my views. But I think you've probably been in a similar boat where you've seen, as a product manager, some interactions with actuaries and data scientists. But also these lines are getting kind of fuzzy, right? You guys are already kind of doing some overlap with these functions. So do these distinctions even make sense anymore? Does it make sense to have product managers, actuaries, and data science different? Is it evolving? What's your view on the landscape?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Max. And obviously, I should probably just state right up front that, I'm not an actuary. I don't carry any credentials as an actuary. But like Alicia mentioned, much of my background in the product management discipline has always had a close interaction with actuarial partners or data scientists, modelers, et cetera. And that really, I would say that intersection of product management, actuarial, and advanced analytics is a critical component of managing the insurance product lifecycle. And really, the winners in this business tend to invest heavily in those capabilities. And the relationship between actuarial and product management is really, really tightly knit, right? And so the closer that you can bring those disciplines together, usually the more effective they tend to be. And so that's really where we see power. And really, that's essentially what we do at MCA, right? We deliver product management services. We have actuarial team members. We obviously deliver more analytical capabilities across the board. So really just seeking to bring those things together for carriers. And that's really what this industry has headed towards for many of the larger carriers. And we see it more broadly across the industry.
Can you talk a little bit about the different roles? Are they starting to get fuzzier lines? So between the product managers versus an actuarial data scientist, are those lines becoming irrelevant? Are you seeing role switching happening more than you used to?
Yeah, absolutely, Alicia. I would say those two things are very closely aligned. And candidly, I've seen a lot of cases where actuaries can oftentimes end up making a jump over into being more of a product manager type of role, right? Folks that have credentials, fully credentialed actuaries in the past have actually made that movement over into becoming product managers and serving that function. So I think that's really just a testament to how interwoven the practices are, but it's not necessarily, they're not mutually exclusive of one another ever really. So there's a lot of overlap and what have you, but really the skill set of an actuary is largely conducive to a successful product manager. So product management, the real difference is as you think about the discipline itself has to be rooted for insurance products specifically, obviously in that view of actuarial, right? Since in insurance, right, we don't know what the future is going to hold. We are really trying to predict what loss costs will be in the future. So a key input to product management is always that actuarial lens. And then where the difference really comes into play is that the product manager really in some of the highest performing product organizations tend to really wear that hat of more of like a general manager, right? So some of the largest, most successful carriers in this space actually describe it as the mini CEO of sort of a product portfolio, whether that would be for a line of business sort of countrywide, or if it's for a specific geography. they tend to really take on that management sort of lens. And that is deeply rooted in the use of high powered analytics modeling as typically the consumer of those types of capabilities as the product manager. But they're really looking to make decisions around how to tune the product and what have you. But then another key component to that is really them analyzing the business from other lenses as well. So working with sales and distribution partners, capturing feedback from underwriting, or even sometimes like claim partners, right? So the product manager has to really take all those inputs in conjunction with that view of the actuarial lens of things, the market lens of things, to do research and understand what's happening out there. What is the market telling me? And the best way to really execute on that is also to bring that back to your actuarial or your modeling partners, and then enhance some of what your models might be doing internally based on what you see the marketplace doing. And so that's where it becomes highly powerful. It really is a partnership when it comes to a successful product manager is going to be really tied to their actuarial partners incredibly tightly. And so that's really where the magic happens, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely agree with that. I thought the analogy of mini CEO was really good, and when I was at the insurance company, I always kind of viewed it more as like the central nervous system, and I think we're saying the same things, right? You're taking the the inputs from different senses and kind of amalgamating it into a strategy. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about just like actuarial blind spots, because I wonder if this is a two-way street. There was a lot of times where I would kind of provide something to the product manager and they're like, I can't do this. And I'm like, I mean, okay, this is what the data is saying. But I also have seen some of the analyses you do for customers. And in particular, you mentioned distribution, right? So this was a thing that like very rarely came up in my actuarial roles or data science roles where, I'd be making recommendations, but I had to account for like the fact that maybe there's a territory where we don't even have distribution anymore. So it doesn't matter if we go anywhere between zero and indicated for that particular segment, those exposures aren't going to renew eventually. So the distributional element, potentially seems like a blind spot. But are there anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, great question, Max. And yeah, you're clearly already versed in some of what can go on, obviously, behind the scenes when you're with that interaction of the relationship between product management and actuarial. I think that's a great example, right? Where it's just differences or nuances within the book of business that might not necessarily be embedded in sort of a recurring indications process, right? Where your actuarial team is constantly trying to provide the most objective opinion of what the future is going to hold through largely initially an indications process, but then feeding that through modeling and some of those other capabilities. And so to your point, right, the product manager's job is really to bring some of the other lenses of the business. So just to key in on one like you just mentioned is right, if there's a difference in underwriting strategies going forward, that's one where I've seen where it's basically that feedback loop to say, hey, we know our indication might be X, but we know that we have a concerted effort and strategy around non-renewals or major pricing segmentation enhancements. And so we believe that our mix might shift as a result of this, or you might see different activities in the marketplace that could be driving future expectations, right, from competitors. And so with that, right, I've seen the case where you might be able to provide that feedback to adjust assumptions, right? And your actuary's job is obviously to make sure that that is actuarially sound and it aligns to obviously standard operating procedures and what have you. And that's really, I think, how that typically functions with a product manager. The other aspect that I think is really key with insurance that we all know is that it's a heavily regulated business, right? So when you think about product management, sometimes I think people oftentimes think of it as a technology product, right? Because that's where you have a constant feedback loop from a customer, and then a technology product manager is going to be constantly tuning their user experience and other things based on that feedback loop. And it tends to just be overall much less regulated than insurance. Obviously, in this case, one of the key things that a product manager is accountable for as well, they're not necessarily the sole driver of compliance, but they are going to wear that regulatory hat. And that's sort of the genesis of usually having a geographic flavor to how you manage and align your product management organizations, because they they really want to get at this concept of ground truth, right? And that's not necessarily a coined term from Drew Hill, right? That's a coined term from some of the best in the business. And that concept of ground truth is where the product manager is going to say, hey, I understand the nuances of my local markets and geographies, and therefore I need to provide that feedback to my actuarial partner, what have you. But then I also know If I have a model that maybe my modeling partners or actuarial partners are bringing to me that might be a countrywide model, my job is to make sure that that fits as effectively and practically into a state level dynamic and environment as possible, right? Because there's just different levels of regulation at the state level with state departments of insurance, and the appetite for some of those modeling components might have to be tweaked and tuned to some of those nuances. And so that's really one of the key roles of the product manager, is really to understand those deep nuances of the marketplace, both from a regulatory perspective, but from a competitive perspective, and really just a macro environmental perspective, where you might just see things at a sub-geographic or sub-segment level that performs differently within a state where that might not necessarily have made its way through sort of a countrywide modeling approach, which is typically what you see, obviously, just to have, your modeling teams want to have the greatest scale of credibility of data as possible. But that's really the product manager's role, is going to be to try to take that model and fit it as strategically as possible to the state and get the best benefit from that.
So maybe can we go a little deeper into this and do the other way around of what you think the blind spots of product are? Because I'll tell you from my experience, maybe the biggest challenge I used to have was that, when you're talking to actuarial folks, there's usually kind of like a fluency or a dialect where you could still have some sort of disagreement, but we're all kind of talking the same language. I felt often when I would go to product, so much variability between this product manager and that product manager. So, for example, some product manager would be like, "Why is this so complex? Just give me 3 variables. I just need it real simple." And then you'd go to someone else who's like, "My state's nothing like the other states. I need a 3-way interaction for coverage A, territory, and you better throw deductible in there also." And, just so much variability. And maybe that's right because they have to localize their strategy. Maybe they're just, one is suboptimal, but they're both fine. That's the challenge I have, is kind of there's no translation that I could take what I'm doing to like the average product manager. They're all very different.
Yeah, I think that is a great point, Max. And yeah, I hate to just kind of piggyback off of what you just said, but it is another fantastic example where, like I mentioned before, obviously from the actuarial side of things, like their role is really to try to provide that objective opinion of risk and the price for risk as good as possible, right? As soundly as possible, I should say. And the product manager is not necessarily purely subjective or what have you, but they also are just trying to balance a wider variety of data points, right? And so I think you're keying in on something that's a key concept, which is that what that can lead to is potential inconsistencies of approaches. And so I wouldn't go as far to say that that's necessarily bad product management, but I would say that the best product management organizations kind of strike that balance between allowing the state product manager to quote unquote run the state, but not necessarily, for lack of a better term, go rogue and say, I need my own custom fit product to this specific state. There's probably a healthy balance of the in between, and that's really the best possible answer. But I would say with a product manager, it usually goes back to, that dynamic of the blind spot could be just the fact that they're trying to create something that is a little too customized to the state, where the answer might be, okay, we can't necessarily adopt just a countrywide model due to these nuances, but we also don't want to over engineer the product per se, just to try to account for every single state specific dynamic, because then you just end up with a higher complexity product that you're trying to manage going forward. And it's difficult from a continuity standpoint as well. Just when you think about over time, if you have 50 states with 50 really unique products, like that is a lot to manage, and it just becomes more difficult. So there's obviously just technical efficiencies as well to be mindful of, but that's probably, I would say, the biggest blind spot for a product, is just leaving that gap for potential inconsistencies. But again, you don't necessarily see that at mass scale typically within product management organizations.
I want to talk a little bit about AI, because that's always one of my favorite topics. You were in our most recent cohort of AI Fast Track, virtual boot camp and discussion board. So I was curious to know what stood out to you, and were there any gaps in insurance training that it filled for you?
Yeah, absolutely, Alicia. And so, I mean, first of all, the AI Fast Track, to just endorse that for a moment, is a tremendous sequence, if you will, of material and content around AI, the developments and progress that has been made, but also making it extremely palatable and practical, and really just in many ways debunking some of what you hear out there in the marketplace. I think obviously in the past 3 to 5 years, there's been just tremendous progress in the AI space. And I think that's just kind of brought with it apprehension, a little bit of concern from folks around, right? I guess the most common question that we always hear at broadly is like, is AI going to take my job or what have you? And so that content, like the Fast Track series, has been just a tremendous help to us, even just the folks from my team that were dialed into that, and really bringing back to, okay, how do I make practical use of AI when it comes to maybe more specifically within the pricing realm. But I also think about it like what I gathered from the AI Fast Track is also just the opportunity for efficiency gain when it comes to working practices, whether you're an actuary, whether you're a product manager, or whether you're a modeler, right? When it comes to data preparation and some of the headaches or challenges that you might feel in any one of those roles, AI could play a significant role just in how you manage some of more of the mundane tasks even of what goes on at that level, right? So, if I'm a product manager and I'm looking for competitor filing activity and I'm really trying to mine through thousands of pages of competitor rate pages and looking for what segmentation changes might have existed, right? There's a use case there that comes with AI and its capabilities that is just a tremendous lift of how you might have previously done that 3 to 5 years ago. But I think just the concepts of taking a step back on AI and realizing that it is a tool that when used practically and effectively, it's obviously going to elevate your experience of what you're working on, how you get to it, and also just leveraging potentially new data points because it has the ability to automate or create more efficiency around how you gather information. That to me is probably the biggest opportunity within AI for in this space, right? And maybe just to click into one other example is when you think about data scientists and really where they might actually span more into becoming like data engineers in the past, because insurance companies naturally tend to have a variety and vast amounts of data in disparate places typically. And so, from just a coding perspective, I've found in past lives and even in some current experiences that if you have data teams, right, they would spend a significant amount of time just trying to prepare data and bring it from disparate sources and get it clean so that it is model ready, right? And so one of the things that I think is a huge lift and a huge leapfrog it's in terms of how it's improving is the ability to use AI for coding purposes to mine through data and actually clean and even enrich the data in some cases to bring disparate sources together, make sure that it's consistent, and that's what's going to deliver ultimately better models, right? And so that really to me is are some of the huge takeaways that I see in terms of the AI use cases. And the fast track really does a nice job of not only tailoring the topics to obviously what's going to help actuaries think differently about how you create efficiencies or how you debunk some of the myths around how we're going to model going forward and what we're going to model going forward, but also just more of those practical use cases. And that's what I really liked about it.
Yeah, and I'm curious. So MCA, if I could kind of summarize the philosophy, is we're still going to be deeply rooted in the domain knowledge and the understanding of the product, what we're trying to accomplish. But you do these kind of like advanced analyses using machine learning to, deliver that to the customer, right? We're going to solve a problem with machine learning. It's still rooted in the domain knowledge and something that they can understand. But at least from our interactions when I'm talking to, it seems like you're putting predictive models built on top of ML in front of customers often. And so I'm curious, you really run the gamut in terms of, commercial lines, personal lines, small customers. When you put that stuff in front of people, do they trust it, right? Are we still in that AI as a black box era and they just want to look at some spreadsheets and Excel? Is there cultural differences between organizations? Where do we stand in terms of this progression?
Yeah, great question, Max. And I would say to your point around sort of what we do at MCA is we try to root ourselves in practical innovation. In certain cases, when warranted, right, we'll go down that path and leverage more of predictive modeling, machine learning, native techniques for clients. But I think we're at a point where we just try to be very mindful of what is the need, like what is the use case that we're trying to solve for, and how do we potentially leverage more advanced capabilities to fit that need, where it's the thought process of are we going to use an impact wrench when really all we need is more of maybe a surgical knife, right? You're going to get a very different outcome if you are not using the right tools for the right use case. So when warranted, I would say we definitely obviously try to leverage some of those techniques to just pinpoint opportunities within the portfolio, analyze market data and do more of like market position or market price based models and some of those dynamics. But I also think we try to be very, very careful about not necessarily delivering a modeled solution when it might not be warranted, right? We try to remain practical. And I also think it's really just key, like whether you're a consultant or you're working inside of a carrier, you still kind of need to meet your partners where they're at, right? And so forcing extremely technical concepts into a discussion without sort of taking that walk before you can run approach can be problematic. And so that's just really where we try to make sure that if we're going to introduce modeling, which we will, in the right approaches or use cases, we need to make sure that it's tailored to the audience, right? And so that we're not introducing more confusion or complexity. And we need to really be eyes wide open in terms of our assumptions and what have you. And we always, that's where I go back to sort of like the product management discipline would say, right? We have great models and we should trust them to the degree that we understand all the assumptions, right? But then we also need to understand what might be the gaps in those models, right? What might we be missing from the equation? And then how do we really come to the point of making a decision about what needs to be done? And that's really how we kind of root our recommendations, is to strike the balance between those things. So to me, it always goes back to positioning. If you're going to model, are you truly leveraging that modeling mindset for predictive purposes to say, I'm actually trying to predict an outcome? Or could I just be modeling to basically do something that's a little bit more descriptive and just understand performance, right? And that's where you might introduce variables that are not necessarily going to make it into your filed rates or what have you. You might be modeling portfolio performance more broadly with additional attributes around distribution or different regulatory or competitor dynamics. You might be able to feed some of those data points into a model just to understand how your performance looks, but you might not necessarily be able to snap that off and send it to a regulator and say, this is now my new pricing model, right? Or something of that nature. And so I think it just goes back to, how are we going to use these capabilities? Like, what is the purpose of what we're trying to get at? Are we really trying to just more deeply understand the portfolio and then walk that into a solution to either make a filed or potentially non-filed pricing changes when it comes to, I'm speaking obviously a little bit more in the commercial lines realm. That's really kind of where we try to strike that balance. Is we obviously will when it's warranted. And it really just goes back to the fact that obviously insurance risk is typically a very multivariate in nature, right? It's not necessarily any one risk attribute that's going to tell you that story. And so in the same light as that, with when it comes to modeling, we might not have all the assumptions, all the inputs in that model. And so we kind of need to strike that balance with other data points. And that's what product managers tend to try to do.
So the AI fast track is one example of upskilling, but in terms of other upskilling for product leaders and tech product managers, what like where do you get your professional development right now? And is there any gap in the insurance specific learning that you're seeking out?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alicia. I think sometimes I mean, that would really just go back to, I think, personal goals in terms of development, in my personal opinion, when it comes to like AI and just trying to better understand sort of what the progression is. To me, this may sound like a very simple and obvious approach, but I think it's been a profound experience just to interact with LLMs on a regular basis to understand how fast the progression is moving, right? Where if you asked a model something 2 years ago or you tried to prompt it to execute a specific task for you, it might have really struggled. But now I think we're at a point where potentially within a month or two, you could have a very different experience with the same use case that you're trying to leverage an LLM for. And so I do see it as just generically, I think that LLMs are just a great learning tool and resource, right? To especially if you're looking to get a more technical in terms of coding and what have you, right? LLMs are never going to provide you the perfect answer. It's the same way any model might not provide you the perfect answer. And so it's not just a lift and load and it's going to do everything for me, but it does enable more iterative learning for a person, right? You can capture feedback. It's very good at debugging and understanding where, a human where you might have spent a significant amount of time, whether it's minutes or hours, looking for, that one comma that you missed in your lines of code or what have you. An LLM is going to find that for you in literally 3 seconds. And so that's just one case where I think about, like, if I'm, a newer in career product manager, call it, 3 to 5 years experience, and I'm really just looking to advance my skill set, just interacting with some of those models and doing like self-learning is an incredibly powerful experience, just because there's so much progression in that space. But I would say, right, plenty of other sort of industry resources and education out there that could be leveraged for this. For us personally, I don't necessarily have ones that I would directly recommend sort of off the shelf. I would say there are just documentation, or I would say research articles out there that tend to be incredibly informative around like what are some of these capabilities actually doing and how do they function. And also there's just research from some of the insurance carriers out there that have published, whether it's for their investor days or for other what they believe are profound use cases, right? There's a lot of discussion of that at industry events. So that's really, I think, where we tend to see some of the interesting use cases is really getting out there and working with either industry partners, vendors, and just capturing some different perspectives on that. And that's where I think there's also potential opportunity.
Yeah, and you and I were talking recently about this new product that Google's releasing. It's kind of like a large language model, but it's more of using a large language model as an interface to interact with all their geospatial machine learning. They've got decades of data on satellite imagery, geospatial stuff, and so the example that they gave was you're able to query how many roofs in this zip code were impacted by this storm, and the model would kind of compare imagery from before and after the storm and produce a result. And it was very eye opening because you could really see just a whole new frontier of applications in underwriting, claims, product pricing. It seems like the future is bright. And so I'm curious if what are your thoughts on that tool? Are there any other tools that you kind of envision filling a gap, or is it just all this stuff is left to our imagination of like what's on the frontier?
Yeah, no, I remember you had shared that with me, Max, and it was it's really interesting to just see just the rapid pace of development out there when it comes to not just AI, but I would say technology in general, from a major player and a huge name in someone like Google, right? And so as I think about it for insurance, it's kind of interesting because the insurance marketplace has had providers of data points, right, or assets for that are leveraging AI technology in that realm for quite some time now, right? Like aerial imagery is probably one of the bigger topics, and it's been prevalent and it's rapidly increased its utilization in the marketplace for underwriting and even for pricing. And so I guess what's interesting to me and what else might it be able to produce and provide new data points or aggregated geospatial data points that might not have existed before. And that's where, or maybe not necessarily not have existed, but just not been as obtainable as they would be through a source like that. And so, that's where I think the landscape is just always changing, no pun intended, when we're talking about geospatial data. But that's really where I see there's opportunity with that to not only enrich potentially your pricing models, your perception of risk, what have you, but also to your point, think about it at the underwriting desk level as well of how you might leverage some of these data points. And I think that's really where I would say more broadly, there's still so much opportunity. I think I mentioned that before, just around this concept of producing new data points that we might not have been able to curate or what have you that are going to change the perception of risk. And so, that's a really interesting concept. And I think it actually goes back to what sometimes a product manager might be doing when it comes to how might the marketplace actually be utilizing some data points on roofing variables, right? And that could potentially inform how a carrier will adapt their own pricing strategies and procure data to run their models with a new data point. And that's obviously going to change the perception of risk. And so what I see is just with that amount of data that could be curated from a major data aggregator such as Google, could really just provide that new lens of something that you could feed through your models and ultimately improve your pricing with. And so that's not necessarily a foreign concept, but that's the landscape, just like the pace of development just seems to continue to be escalating from that perspective. And I think it's just a really interesting dynamic. And so I would personally like to take a look at it more. I don't know a ton about really what the entire landscape of what Google's really looking to produce there, but I do think it has incredible potential applications for insurance carriers, for other industries when it comes to right disaster relief or disaster management and preparation. There could be a lot of applications that could be used broadly there. And so, yeah, excited to learn more about it.
We've talked a bit about the product leaders, product managers, and how they can get more domain knowledge for insurance work. On the flip side of that, since we have a lot of actuaries who listen to the podcast, is there any upskilling they should be doing on product strategy or statistical thinking that will help them be better collaborators? Anything that you recommend there?
Not to just pivot back to sort of the concept of just collaboration and the intersection of product management and actuarial, but I think the real value is both parties tend to learn from each other very well. So it's just capturing a more balanced perspective of the business, but it really is a symbiotic relationship. So When I think about maybe just conceptually to sort of round out potentially an actuary more in the product management and understand that discipline, that to me, it really just comes from embedding yourself within that partnership between the product manager and the actuary. That's probably a simple recommendation, is to really just spend more time together, like learning some of those concepts. But I think that goes both ways, because product managers really, like, usually product management development usually first comes from understanding actuarial concepts, right? So that is a key, it's such a key input to product management that product managers need to have a foundational knowledge of some of the actuarial nuances and how a rate indication and trends are developed and how losses develop over time, like all those different aspects, reserving, right? All the inputs that go into pricing, that's what you need to know from that perspective. So I think that could also go the other direction for an actuary, where if you're really operating, depending on what your actuarial function might be, because that obviously can look very different. If you're a reserving actuary, you might really just need to get deep in domain knowledge and ground truth with your claims partners, right? To understand, hey, when a claim comes in, how do we identify certain aspects of the claim, or determine whether we think this is going to go a different path and triage to potentially like a litigation dynamic, because that all that will impact ultimately your reserves, right? So the same could be said for an actuary that's more focused on pricing or even modeling, what have you. It really just goes back to, hey, understanding what else could we be thinking about when it comes to enriching our models. If we're thinking about R&D for pricing purposes, we can obviously take that and just look at it from, I'll call it the pure internal lens, right? Just to say, hey, we have all these data points that we have on risks, and we're going to model that and introduce new data and bring more years of experience into the model so that we can enhance them. Or we might look at third parties or what have you. But a lot of times that can be informed by your product manager. And so understanding sort of where those dynamics come from can usually inform how you develop the models internally for that, right? It can help inform strategies. So that's where I think, just to go back to like the concept of competitive intelligence, that can help inform how you actually fit some of your variables in your model. You might see consistencies in how competitors do it. For one, that could help from a regulatory perspective, but it also probably helps from just like a general model quality perspective. So that's where I think like just sort of that nature of reciprocal learning between actuarial and product that's just a huge opportunity, I think, for everybody. And it's just going to continue to evolve. The last thing in terms of for actuaries, and again, I think this is a little bit more broad too. It's not just actuaries, it's product managers, it's data scientists. It's really like continue to challenge yourself with all the tools and capabilities that are out there. We continue to try to push this internally at MCA is, hey, what am I doing that I could be leveraging AI to do a little bit better, right? So it's just incremental progress tends to go a long way, and sort of leaning into, it's maybe not the same thing, Max, as like a modeling mindset, but it is more of, hey, how do we constantly gain efficiencies to improve the quality of our work, the quality of our output, and the quality of our work experience? And so that's where there's a ton of opportunity there, right? Where it comes to, hey, leveraging AI to adjust maybe your PowerPoint visuals and make sure that your language is succinct and consistent throughout a presentation. Or you might be leveraging it to extract data that you previously would have done more manually. And so I think broadly speaking, like the efficiency gains that could have implications for actuaries, whether they're looking to apply development factors to losses, or aggregate their trends, what have you, and maybe produce a little bit more automation so that they can focus on other more high value activities. That's where I think the real benefit lies, of just continuously upskilling is, I think, more at our fingertips now than ever, in short.
I definitely agree with that. It's actually been kind of a running joke in the podcast that every episode we kind of learn that insurance is so compartmentalized and we just need to learn more about the process. And so it's happening again where someone's kind of saying we just need to understand a little bit more. I'll also mention too that your point about looking at competitors through competitive analysis to inform what you do, it reminds me of an example when I was in high frequency telematics. Virtually every carrier was contextualizing hard brakes by mileage, right? The idea was, if you had, a lot of braking, but you're also driving a lot, that should be contextualized as like a ratio. And I remember looking at Tesla's driver score that goes into their insurance product, and it would contextualize the number of hard brakes versus the number, or I'm sorry, the number of extreme hard brakes relative to the hard brakes. So it wasn't like a distance thing. It was more of like, extreme hard brakes should be proportional to hard brakes. And I thought that was really interesting and just something that I never would have thought of. I never got the chance to actually, see if that would have been a better way to do it, but it did remind me of that. And I kind of agree with you that, sometimes within an organization, you can just kind of like have these blinders on, and you need that competitive research to like really understand what is going on in the market, who's doing something new, creative. But I also see it kind of cutting both ways because I've seen some sloppy stuff, if I could put it nicely, right? Where sometimes a competitor just is doing something that makes no sense. And a younger analyst would probably fall victim to that if they didn't have that kind of like understanding that this is probably not worth doing. So I'm curious, do you kind of bump into similar things when evaluating decisions based on competitors?
I would say absolutely, Max. And yeah, to your point, I think I've heard a number of just sort of anecdotes and stories around like contextualizing is key, right? Or accounting for the multivariate nature of our business, right? It's a little bit daunting because there's so many things that you could explore. But that's what I think actually when it comes back to like what competitors or, just what you see out in the marketplace. And then I also think there's a little bit, this is again with probably a word of caution, is like intuition, for lack of a better term. So sometimes what I would say, like within maybe more specific to product management, what you see oftentimes is sometimes you might hear something like feedback from your underwriting staff, right, around how they think about risks differently and what they're trying to account for a certain risk profile or class as opposed to another. Obviously, I'm speaking a little bit again in terms of commercial lines. My experience tends to skew a little bit more towards commercial lines, but that I've seen become really powerful when you bring that back up and then try to look at it and tell that story with data. It tends to be incredibly informative. You tend to see it again geographically. There could be nuances, but I think really like that concept of doing a little bit more of like gathering research and feedback could be extremely informative to sort of enhancing your models. I think I've told you this story, Max, and it's a bit of an anecdote, and it sort of tees up this concept of if you can iteratively and continuously look differently at risk and also introduce new research, new variables, it really could lead to pivotal movements in how you assess and price for risk. And so this is an anecdote. Actually, it's not related to insurance, but when I read it in a book, it really stuck out to me as a profound example of how you could improve with risk selection and pricing for risk potentially just through an enhanced lens of doing really good ground level research and looking at what's out there. So it's actually in the realm of horse racing. It's the story of American Pharoah. So that's a racehorse. I'm not really a racehorsing guy. There was a guy named Jeff Cedar, and he was an investment banker. He took up a passion for his true calling. He believed was like, apparently to get into more of understanding what makes a winning racehorse, right? So obviously somebody from probably a very technical analytical background, but really set out to just understand like what truly makes a winning racehorse. And so in his research, he found a few interesting things that I think deviated significantly from what the industry of horse racing would typically think of as a winning racehorse. As we all infer, maybe just not from knowing a ton about horse racing myself, the industry typically would look at, right, the genetic pedigree of a horse as a major input to the performance of that horse, or maybe the gait of how they run, if they have certain behaviors, right? Are they motivated as a horse? Different things like that. It might have been maybe what you'd consider a little bit more gut feel or what have you. But what this gentleman did was he went and researched thousands of horses, gathered data points that were never really looked at previously. So what he found was that essentially, which would make intuitive sense if we had looked at this data point previously, most likely, is that the size of the left ventricle of a horse's heart is incredibly indicative of their racing performance. But not only that, that paired with the size of their spleen for some reason was actually the most profound interaction that predicted sort of the performance of a horse. And then he went a little bit further and sort of peeled back the onion to say, at the ground level, what he did is he actually sat out at the racetrack and he listened and found that any horse that wheezes in the last turn of a race usually never closes in that race, right? No, maybe that one, not so much of an explanation as you would intuitively think about like some of the, the dynamics with the what's inside of the horse. What he ended up doing was he basically found a horse that had a pedigree that was like 70th percentile. But then what he found was that same horse was like 99th percentile for some of those attributes that we had just talked about. No wheezing. And so the horse ended up being owned by the same person who hired this gentleman to go to the auction to find a winning horse. And so he ultimately recommended that this owner bought back the same horse that he brought to auction for sale because of what he found. That horse ended up being American Pharoah, which is a horse that was the first ever Grand Slam winner, which is the Triple Crown, I think, plus the Breeders' Cup. That to me was just so profound in terms of like how we think about potentially with like insurance risk, a new lens of data and the interaction of these attributes that we would have not previously looked at leads to a major breakthrough in outcomes. I think that's where, somebody is going to find ultimately what improves the pricing for risk. It doesn't mean that we all have to go out and find some really profound research ourselves. In the insurance marketplace being a little more regulated, and you can typically capture some of that feedback from either your partners, but then more so also from just what you see from a regulatory filing perspective. And that I think could lead to still tremendous progress in internal performance.
Yeah, it's a great story of just kind of like ground up analysis, and I have a feeling it's going to be a data vendor who figures this out, and they're going to charge us a fortune for it. But no, I really love the story, and I do think like it's nice to just have that in the back of your mind instead of just looking at a spreadsheet, crunching numbers, kind of taking a step back and thinking more holistically from a different lens, right? Trying to enhance what we do can really go a long way, especially probably in commercial lines too, where it's not as like number crunchy. There's a whole lot of gaps in the data that we have already.
Exactly. And there's so much variation, I would say, in terms of the market's opinion for risk. That's where you typically find with other, like some of the data that you can look at out there from how relevant you might be on price, right? Market relevant price, I think, is a really key concept. That usually, right, if there's gaps in your internal credibility, again, this all goes back to a little bit to like more like the product management mindset. Oftentimes the market will tell you if there's a nuance that you might see. So that's where looking at sometimes so just your competitive metrics could serve as sort of leading indicators for performance. And it also could help inform sort of where you might have gaps or just opportunities for enhancing pricing.
And I have to interject a random horse statistic because I grew up a horse person. The very famous Secretariat, when they were trying to figure out why does this horse like win all these races, they discovered his heart was huge. So the average horse's heart is 8.5 pounds, and his was 22 pounds. So
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
interesting.
Well, hopefully
fact.
I didn't totally misstate that story
No, no,
earlier, Alicia,
I
since I
don't.
didn't know that you were a horse
No, no,
person. So
I'm not like I'm not not into the racing stats or anything. So just a former horse owner for many years. So
yeah, that's awesome.
I'll
um,
mention one of my clients has a line of business specifically for horse, and they haven't modeled it yet, but I'm really excited. So, Alicia, you might have a consulting opportunity
oh,
coming
okay.
up soon.
Well, let's move into our lightning round. So we'll ask you a couple rapid fire questions. My first is, do you have a favorite data visualization or dashboard tool?
Ooh, good question. How fast do I have to answer these, by the way?
uh,
Yeah, a simple answer, I would say. It's hard for me to give one answer, so I'll give you two. I find that what tends to resonate really across the board with business partners from a visualization standpoint is tying back to geography. So building maps that are really interactive and having the ability to sort of look at metrics at different levels of geography tends to tell a really interesting story. And the more that you can kind of interact those capabilities with some of your other core attributes or variables, like that tends to be really profound for folks because people, if you think about stakeholder management, like people tend to really be able to conceptualize geography. Whereas in other cases, if you're just thinking about just other variables and you're trying to convey sort of complex interactions, obviously that gets pretty busy and pretty technical really quick. But in my opinion, you can never build too cool of a map, right? It just tends to really resonate with folks. And so that might be one. And then the other I would say is a little bit more of like heat mapping, right? So you can understand like anytime you can conceptualize what I describe as like pairing metrics, where you could say, hey, what's the size of my exposures or volume that I might see in a certain area? But also paired with maybe a color grade to say, hey, here's where we're high or low on competitiveness or loss ratio or what have you. That tends to lead to really good hotspot analysis. And models can help with that as well. But in terms of visualization, I would say I'm a sucker for a good heat map as well.
Promise I didn't write this question. It's going to seem like a plug. How will low code platforms reshape workflows, and which regulatory or tech shifts worry you the most?
Wow, that's a great question. Am I allowed to say accurate on this podcast?
Yeah, I think you are. But again, I didn't ask that question. So,
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I would say, I definitely am a believer that like low code platforms are going to be a true game changer for insurance. It reduces the barrier to entry and really just the time intensity it takes to build models. It really just shifts how you're going to spend your time, if you will, in terms of getting to a modeled output and understanding the output and then making a decision, rather than spending just a substantial amount of time writing code, debugging code, making sure that it's scalable and what have you, and also just trying to tune that model to different capabilities and enhancements or what have you. Full transparency, obviously, like we are users of Accurate at MCA, and for those reasons, right? We are in more the business of leveraging these capabilities to produce better outputs that are transparent, interpretable, but also account for the multivariate nature of risk. And like I mentioned before, that also just tailors back to like the practicality of things. We try to innovate more so in that sort of low code, no code type of space because, we see the value in building really good data sets that are going to lead to better models and pairing that with other data points that are going to lead to better decisions and better outcomes. But accounting for those multivariate interactions is a key aspect of it. So it's just gonna shift the way that folks think, and I don't think it's gonna necessarily de-skill or devalue any given skill set or capability that somebody might have, because somebody who's a data scientist is still going to have the ability to enrich some of these capabilities, because no solution out of the box is going to serve every single one of your needs. So it's really about how do you spend more time elevating the capabilities around that, but having sort of a core solution that sort of increases the speed at which you can actually obtain models, build models, and ultimately manage a lot more models when it comes to multi different aspects of the business, right? And so, right with that, obviously, still comes a degree of caution because there's learning, right? You still have to understand and make sure that you can interpret and convey the concepts of what you've built, and also make sure that it's not biased, it's not overly rigid or noisy. It has to be something that is ultimately usable. And so that's really where you can index your time more towards, rather than doing sort of the ground up builds. And that's where kind of I see really the greatest opportunity. And I think we've obviously reaped the benefits of that as well.
And can you finish the sentence? In 3 years, the biggest change to actuarial and product strategy will be.
Navigating complexity will probably be the biggest change when it comes to actuarial and product, just because in the landscape that we have, obviously we talked a lot about new data sources and some of those dynamics, but also again in this world of AI and just more machine learning, and getting deeper and deeper into some of those nuances. Like I think naturally there's going to be just an interest in capturing those new data points, building higher complexity capabilities, and trying to implement them. And so navigating that with regulators is going to be a major challenge, but also making it also fit within business context, right? And that's really, I think, a key aspect of this as well is, right, the best model may not, and this is not necessarily something new that's going to happen in 3 years, it's already going on, where the best model may not always be the best ultimate business answer to implement in your product. And so that's something I would say in the next 3 years, just for folks to just continue to be mindful of that concept, because there's going to be increasing amounts of data points. The quality of that data is going to change, likely improve. But with that might come the opportunity to introduce more complexity. And so I think it's really just navigating that back to practicality, and really obviously ultimately being able to justify that as a warranted change, and maybe not just some sort of interaction, if you will, that we might have picked up on, or something that's going to be really difficult to manage. Or it also always in insurance goes back to, right, rates must not be excessive, redundant, or unfairly discriminatory. And so that's always just something that like we're always going to navigate that. And I think just with changing complexity comes the need to keep that at the forefront.
Yeah, and I think that's even just a good for the young folks on the call right now. I'll say this industry is so much more complex than it was 10 years ago, and it's going to be a challenge to kind of navigate that without all the battle wounds of the past. So I am curious how it'll be done, but it is interesting because I have some clients where they have young analysts who they don't have any of the rate making background when they're jumping right into the predictive models, and they are kind of able to pick that up. So it will be interesting if that even fuels more complexity. And we'll probably see, like you said, like the winners and losers will be the ones that can navigate this complexity better.
Yeah, absolutely, Max. Totally agree.
What are you reading or watching right now?
I basically just started the book Why We Sleep, right? So that's just a really interesting. I'm not a big fiction reader, obviously, and I'm not a huge reader in general, if I'm being honest. But yeah, I'm reading the book Why We Sleep, which is ultimately just a fascinating deep dive into like the ins and outs, and obviously just like the nature of why the human body needs to shut down for ideally 8 hours per evening and things of that nature. So it's a really great read just in terms of understanding, like it dives much deeper into just the practicality of what everybody usually thinks about is like, well, I should sleep because I just want to be less tired during the day. Like, no, there's an entire process that really goes on that ultimately impacts your entire lifestyle when it comes to sleep. And so I would definitely recommend that to any of our listeners to pick up if you're just looking for a little bit of new learning. So yeah, Why We Sleep is a great one.
Yeah, I've read this book. It definitely had a profound impact on me. I don't yell at my kids often, but if my wife is asleep and they're going to wake her up, I scream at them because of this book. Like, let her sleep, let her sleep. So, yeah, definitely a good read. I try not to, when you read a book, change your whole life, but like this one made a very persuasive argument for the value of sleep.
Yeah, it could be a little bit daunting too if you're not a great sleeper as it is. It's like tough to kind of change some of those habits or what have you. But it just goes back to just understanding what habits are going to make you ultimately healthier as a person and a little more at peace as well.
Well, thanks, Drew. For the audience, Drew's a good friend of mine. He and I exchange text messages quite a bit. They're huge block text messages of us going back and forth with ideas. So it's always great to have you on here. And I think it'd be great if you could come back and guest host with us as well, just to give us that technical product manager lens on some of these discussions.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Max. Yeah, like you said, it's always fun when we get going on ideas and everything. So fun to at least toss a few of those around today. And yeah, I really hope that your listeners at least gain some value of hearing me talk about these concepts.
Those are all our questions. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. So that was a great conversation with Drew. I hope everyone listening enjoyed that, had some great takeaways. We did mention the AI Fast Track as part of our conversation. I just want to make everyone aware that there is another cohort of AI Fast Track kicking off May 13th. So if you're interested in joining, registration is limited. You can find out more information on our website and get signed up. And we hope to see you there, as well as on our next episode of Almost Nowhere.
Thanks, everyone.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official position of the Casualty Actuarial Society, its subsidiaries, or the employers of the hosts and guests. This podcast may discuss topics related to insurance and regulatory issues, but the information shared should not be considered as legal or regulatory advice.